here. We sincerely appreciate it. If it were not for you folks who love this airplane, hopefully as much as we do, we'll try to convince you to love it if it's not your favorite airplane. Anyway, the greatest challenge this airplane, or this country has ever done is build this airplane. Kelly Johnson did an amazing achievement. My name is Tom Danielson. I flew the SR-71 and the U-2, so. And you can read these as much as I can. However, we are proud to be here at the museum for 6th through the 8th of this year. Anyway, that's one of our famous pictures with the sunburst slide by the intake. The Blackbird started off as the A-12, which is a single-seat airplane. It was actually a higher flying airplane. It only flew for a year because I think the powers that be realized one person could not do everything and do justice to it. So SR-71, a derivative of the 12, about 6 feet longer, very successful Mach 3 plus reconnaissance aircraft, and operated for about 25 years. Pilot and RSO, Reconnaissance Systems Officer. The YF-12 was similar to the SR-71 air-to-air interceptor. They realized you could not sit alert with it, and there was no real viable threat. But pilots and our radar intercept officers could not sit in a spacesuit for 24 hours at a time. And plus it takes about 24 hours to pre-flight the airplane. So therefore, it realistically could not be sitting alert with it. D-21, finally, there's an example here at the museum, was a unmanned drone, initially launched from a M21 aircraft, which the only surviving example is up in Seattle right now, but they realized after they lost one airplane that that was probably not a good idea. The D-21 mission was to overflight what's called denied territory and come back and drop its camera capsule, and mid-air C-130 was going to catch it, so a lot of things could go wrong with that. Initially, in 1974, the airplane was first displayed at Farnborough Air Show, and they set speed records going to and coming from 1974. We'll talk a little bit more about speed records in a little bit. The airplane was extremely hot. At standard day Mach 3, 80 plus thousand feet. You can read that as well as I can. 750 degrees was the average temperature. It got up to 1,200 degrees back at the engine exhaust and the front cockpit. The inside glass was 620 degrees. So if we wanted to, the pilots wanted to heat tube food, we just held it 3 seconds on each side and it was hot. So we could eat that. Cool, but it was due to its black color. It's actually a special coating, a radar absorbent coating. The shape of the airplane was such that there's no 90-degree angles to it. It's as big as a DC-9 airliner, and it looks about a Cessna 150 on radar. It was the original stealth airplane before stealth was even known. Everything, the cockpits, the equipment bays, all cooled by air conditioning and fuel heat exchangers. So you'd know when you started getting low on fuel without even looking at the fuel gauge. You could tell because the cockpit started getting hot because it wasn't being cooled as effectively anymore. And pilots and RSOs in a full pressure suit, breathing 100% oxygen, so they can denitrogenate and not suffer decompression sickness, the bands. Again, it's just an example. Way at the back in the orange colors, 1200 degrees plus, and the cockpits are around 600 plus degrees. The front cockpit is antiquated. It's a bunch of round dials, which is, there's no TV screens at all. Looks very complicated, but you know what to look at, when to look at it. So the airplane is flown with a control stick, and most of the time when you're flying supersonic, it's through the autopilot system. So it helps a little bit, except it's still not terribly simple. So those are the main things we look at. Here's the fuel remaining gauge and fuel boost pumps. There's about 7 tanks on the airplane, so you got to monitor that for center of gravity. The airplane will always want to go to a supersonic center of gravity, which doesn't work when you're flying low altitude trying to land. So we had some special deals there. The back seat was our RSO will talk a little bit more about that possibly, but you know, there's no flight controls, no flight instruments in the back. When we get to the sensitive areas called, the backseater has the primary job. About 75% of his duties, or 25% pilot, 75% backseater. So we navigated with an Astro tracker. It's called, it tracked stars, even in the daytime. So about 2 minutes after you go out, taxi out of the barn, it starts tracking stars. Guaranteed 300 feet within, faster than a rifle bullet. So, and this was before the days of GPS. So it was an amazing system. It worked very well. One of the sensors we had was an optical bar camera up in the nose of the airplane, possibly, and it basically tracked the route of flight of the airplane. Other thing was the SR-71, which is actually a great system and very high resolution, very long range, looking side to side, and it generates actually a picture through 40,000 feet of clouds. So what cameras wouldn't work, the radar system does. 1 foot resolution, which is pretty good out at the range that we're talking about. A big technical objective camera is in the side bays, chine bays of the airplane. We pretty much always flew with TAC cameras, and it was it would automatically point at targets and take pictures. This example, this is the Seattle Kingdome from 80,000 feet, and you cannot read license plates. However, you can certainly see what kind of cars they are. Your panel of experts, Ed Yeilding, right here, world record holder. Doug Soifer, one of the reconnaissance systems officers. We cannot fly the airplane by ourselves. Mike Hall, maintenance, and I believe you worked cameras. Is that right, Mike? Electronic warfare. Sorry about that. Harvey Smith, Maintenance? Photo, okay. Well, an aspect of maintenance. And Floyd Jones?
Crew chief.
Crew chief, so really big time maintenance. Steve Justice, the Lockheed Skunk Works historian and engineer?
Yes.
Yes, great. Ed Yeilding in his younger days, on the right side. That was before his record-setting final flight. Doug Soifer, also on the right side, also in his younger days. Very handsome guy. Mike Hall, also equally handsome, but cameras and sensors and what else did you do? Electronic warfare, that's right. That's what you told me. And I'm sorry, Harvey and Floyd don't have pictures of you guys, but and Steve, senior engineer and historian of the Skunk Works. Everybody knows what Skunk Works means, right? We'll talk about that in a little bit. And finally, the absolute genius of the whole thing, the reason the SR-71 worked as well as it did, and all the other airplanes he worked on, including the U-2, F-104, the P-8/F-80, the P-38 in World War II, was because of this guy, Kelly Johnson. His Skunk Works team developed and built the SR and many other airplanes. And we'll get to the questions after we show a short video. We have about a 6-minute video on Kelly Johnson, and you'll hopefully learn a lot more about this absolute genius of a designer. Thank you.
Dear Kelly, you and I have never met. I'm not a former SR-71 pilot or RSO. I wasn't a member of your design team at the Lockheed Skunk Works or on the assembly line that built the Blackbird. Nor was I a member of the Air Force at Beale, Mildenhall, or Kadena, who kept the Blackbirds flying. I'm not even an airplane buff in the classic sense. I'm just a person that had the privilege of being around your SR-71 Blackbird, and it was an experience I will remember intensely for the rest of my life. There's just something about your Blackbird, Kelly, that words don't adequately describe. Anyone who has been near a Blackbird and felt its presence knows what I'm talking about. It's a feeling in your gut, and instantly you want to be part of it. Part of what I call the Blackbird family. Today, Kelly, you are being honored for your design work on the SR-71, and justly so. To me, the SR-71 is not only your greatest aircraft design, it is perhaps the greatest aircraft ever built. I've heard it said that you considered the Blackbird the most fascinating challenge of your career. No wonder. It was a design that was so advanced that everything that touched it had to be new. New manufacturing processes, new tools, new materials, a whole new approach. You built an operational stealth aircraft a decade before most of the world had even heard the term. It was a design so far ahead of its time that it retired before time could catch up with it. In times of crisis, the Blackbird provided 6 presidents with a unique and critical view of the world. The Blackbird served this country for just over a quarter of a century. In that entire time, it stood in a class of one. To me, the Blackbird is much more than a technical marvel. It's an airplane that gets inside you, an aircraft that causes the adrenaline to flow just by looking at it. Kelly, your Blackbird is the stuff dreams are made of. It's the model plane sitting in a young child's room, proof that everything is possible, that the sky isn't the limit. And it's the poster hanging on the office wall of a middle-aged engineer, testimony that yes, even in the real world, miracles do occur. The SR-71 embodies all that excites people about aerospace. Its crew seems part pilot, part astronaut. The Blackbird itself appears part airplane, part spacecraft. The typical Blackbird fan is a cross-section of America. It's your grandfather, your niece, your son. It's the wide-eyed young kid that buys an aircraft book at the National Air and Space Museum. It's the family that traveled hundreds of miles to an air show just to see a Blackbird in person. It's the people on the Air Force Base that stopped what they were doing to watch an SR take off. Everyone, every time, no matter how many times they'd seen it before. And it's the pilot who last flew the Blackbird 20 years ago, who has the look in his eye that says, I flew the best aircraft ever made. The look that can barely contain the desire to get in an SR just one more time and light the burners. When Blackbird 972 made its final record-setting flight to Dulles Airport, I watched the television with mixed emotions. This was the Blackbird's final flight. An aircraft that was the very definition of speed and power would fly no more. But my sadness was tempered by the knowledge that this plane would now truly belong to the nation, coming to rest in the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. Now millions would be able to do what I had done, be near a Blackbird, be part of the family. Kelly, in the years to come, whenever I want to experience your airplane's majesty, I will remember the time I spent with your Blackbird, the smell of JP7 fuel, the feel of it on the soles of my shoes, the sound of an air starter wind up, the TEB ignite, and I'll put on the film that we shot during those incredible weeks in 1987. I'll watch it, feel it, be part of it again. Because in movies, Kelly, like in our memories, your Blackbird will fly forever. Congratulations, Kelly, and thank you. Devin Hawker, Assistant Cameraman, Blackbird, the movie.
Well, folks, hope you enjoyed that little short video. And now I'd like to introduce you to our panel. Ed Yeilding would like to talk first about stories of the SR-71, his favorite stories. And Ed is the pilot of the last SR-71 that was flown. 2 days ago, it was the 30th anniversary of that flight. He set 4 world records on that flight. So anyway, he's also the finest gentleman I've ever met. Thanks, Ed.
Thank you, Tom. Well, I'm Ed Yeilding from Florence, Alabama. We're raised in Florence, went to school at Auburn. In the Air Force, flew the RF-4 for 5 years, almost 6 years, and then the F-4 fighter for 3 years. Then a dream came true. I got to fly the SR-71 for 6 years, got 785 hours in the aircraft. After the SR-71, I flew out of Andrews for 5 years, and then airlines for 13 years, Northwest Airlines, and then retired as a Delta pilot. But absolutely love flying every airplane I've ever flown, but my favorite would have to be the SR-71 Blackbird. I first learned about it when I was age 15 President Johnson announced its existence, and I was 15. I thought, man, I'd like to fly that airplane someday. But it's a dream come true. Flew it for 6 years and was just in the right place at the right time to fly that final flight. By the way, before that final flight, I was able to fly 93 overseas reconnaissance missions. We took a lot of pride in all our missions. We felt like we were doing something really important for our country, gathering reconnaissance in hostile areas of the world, keeping a watch on countries that might start hostilities. So we all took a lot of pride in those missions. So we were really sad when it was time to retire the aircraft after its 25 years of service. So its retirement was announced in December of 1989. And then the Smithsonian said, we want one for display. And they sent a letter to the Secretary of the Air Force and said, please have your pilot set an official coast-to-coast speed record when you bring the airplane to the Smithsonian, and that will call the public's attention to what a great, great airplane it was for our country for 25 years of the Cold War. And J.T. Vita and I were just in the right place at the right time to fly that flight from California to the Smithsonian and fly that record flight. And we just felt really fortunate, very, very fortunate to fly that flight. Any of the crew members had the skill to fly the flight, so I think of it not as my record, it's definitely the Blackbird's record. They keep saying I'm a record holder, but it's the Blackbird that has the record, and I was just lucky enough to be the pilot that day. J.T. Vita was in my backseat, RSO, great, great reconnaissance systems officer. He was an outstanding, really outstanding at his job, very popular with all the crews. He had more time in the Blackbird than any other crew member in history. He had 1,392.7 hours in the airplane. Sadly, he got cancer and passed away 2.5 years after our record flight. We sure miss him. It was just really a great, great guy. So I was really honored to fly that flight with J.T. Vita. So I'll tell you just a little bit about that flight. We took off from Palmdale, California on March the 6th of 1990, which is exactly 30 years ago, 2 days ago. We flew 200 miles out over the Pacific and air refueled. We lit the afterburners and got a 200-mile running start toward the West Coast. As we crossed the West Coast, the NAA, the National Aeronautic Association, that's the agency that officially monitors official speed records. So they started the time as we crossed the West Coast, and they got the time as we crossed the East Coast. So we crossed the East Coast. We're accelerating toward the sun. We had taken off before sunrise, accelerating toward the sun, so the sun's coming up very rapidly. I'll never forget what a beautiful sight it was crossing the West Coast in the twilight. I could see all the millions of lights of Los Angeles down below. Over 300 miles to my left, I could see the lights of San Francisco. To my right, I could see the lights of San Diego, and then the darkness of Mexico beyond that. But it was still bright enough that I could see the white ocean breakers all along the California coastline. I'll never forget that beautiful sight. Then we're flying toward the sun, so the sun's coming up rapidly. A few minutes later, we're passing right by the Grand Canyon. I could see the Grand Canyon National Park on my left side. A few minutes later, we're passing the majestic mountains of southwest Colorado and passed about 60 miles south of Pikes Peak, which from the top of Pikes Peak, Catherine Bates was inspired to write that wonderful song, America the Beautiful, one of my absolute favorite songs. And then a few minutes later, we're just right over that fruited plain that she sang about in that song, hundreds of miles of prime American farmland. It's a special flight, so I'm having some special thoughts. I'm thinking, gosh, just 150 years prior, our brave pioneers were making their way across that same country, taking months across country that we're crossing in just a matter of minutes. Thought about what a great country we have, made great by the hard work and sacrifices and prayers of our forefathers. Thought about all those thousands of farmers down there raising food that feeds most of our country. The eastern part of the United States was undercast, so I didn't see many features in the eastern part of the country during our dash, supersonic dash. We're cruising at Mach 3.3, top speed of the airplane, almost 2,200 miles an hour, faster than a speeding bullet. So JT and I just made sure we enjoyed our last few minutes of flying that marvelous airplane, enjoyed one last view of God's earth from 80,000 feet, the slight curvature of the earth, the blackness overhead because we're above 97% of the air molecules, a bright band of blue on the horizon. Thought about how fortunate we were to serve alongside hundreds of highly dedicated men and women who served the airplane through the years. Then when we crossed the East Coast, the Blackbird had just set a speed record, coast-to-coast speed record, flown that coast-to-coast faster than any airplane has before or since. It was 67 minutes and 54 seconds. Fuel was pretty tight, so we started a tight left-hand turn back toward Dulles. We had planned it so that we would have just enough fuel to land with the minimum fuel at Dulles, but they wanted me to make a few passes for the crowd there, so they set up a tanker. So once I'm subsonic and going toward Dulles Airport, we tapped the tanker and took just a little bit more fuel so we could make a couple of passes for the crowd there. We did make those passes, lit the afterburner, and they took a picture of us low altitude by the crowd, and that picture was on the front page of the Washington Post the very next morning, March the 7th, 1990. Then there was a short ceremony as we passed the airplane over to the Smithsonian, and then there was a nice reception that night for the air crews and other Lockheed people that supported the airplane. So it was really nice. So JT and I were just really fortunate for that experience. 2 days later, though, we had to climb on board a United Airlines 767 for a nonstop flight from Dulles back to California to our base, nonstop flight in a 767. And it was a nice flight and all, and the service was good, but gosh, it took 5 hours to get back to California. But it was a day to remember. So blessed for that opportunity. Thank you.
Now that's going to be a tough act to follow, I'll tell you that. I'm Doug Soifer. Got to fly the plane for 5 years and 4 years at the Pentagon. Well, after the flying, I went to a year-long school at Maxwell Air Force Base, and at that time they closed the program when I was at school, so they didn't know what to do with me, so they sent me to the Pentagon to get into the space world, and I was in the space world for the rest of my career, the Pentagon, and then fortunate enough, I didn't know it at that time, I got to go to Hurlburt Field, Air Force Special Operations Command, to bring this space capability, and I feel very fortunate to be in the best two communities of the United States Air Force, Recon and Air Force Special Operations Command. Pretty amazing. Anyway, I got 2 short stories for you. But before that, everyone, Tom and Eddie mentioned RSO, Reconnaissance Systems Officer. Everyone knows what the pilot's doing. He's the famous guy. Everyone wants his autograph. But what about us in the back seat? What does an RSO do? An RSO is a rated navigator in the United States Air Force. So his primary job is navigation. He's a co-pilot. He runs all the checklists. He was the comms guy, ran all the radios, and basically did what the mission was. He ran all the sensors, all the cameras. So he was a mixture of and a flight engineer working, the CG and everything. So he was a mixture of doing many things. Okay, I got 2 short stories for you. So Mike was my front seater. Mike, in this program, you team up with a guy day 1 of training, and Mike and I were basically married to each other for 5 years. It was that close a crew coordination. So Mike and I are in our first TDY to England, RAF Mildenhall. So we go in a flight. We only had a couple of flights there, so we were basically a new crew. We go in for a normal flight. I think it was a 6-hour flight. And the difference from the other few flights we took, they had Air Force global weather from Offutt Air Force Base on the radio, on the telephone. And we thought that was strange. Why are they briefing us from Offutt Air Force Base instead of the local weather officer from Mildenhall that usually briefed us? So we listened to the briefing, and it was a long briefing, but didn't think anything of it. Got our intel briefing, did everything, got dressed, went out to the cockpit, flew a Code 1, no maintenance problems, 6-hour mission. We came back to Mildenhall, totally normal, landed. In the SR world, when you land from an operational mission, you taxi off the runway right into, we call it the barn, right into the hangar. So they could close the doors and download the sensors so no satellites could see it. So we taxi off and they hold us. Set our call sign, hold where you are. So Mike and I, being new guys, damn, we did something wrong. The door opens from the barn, about 300 feet in front of us, and out comes a guy dressed in a full chem suit. He walks slowly to the plane and walks around the plane with a Geiger counter. And now Mike and I say, I guess our career's over. We didn't know what we did, but something is wrong. I mean, we really did not know what we did. Anyway, after he cleared it, we taxied, they cleared us, taxied in, we got out of the cockpit, walked down the stairs, and at that time the deck commander was Lieutenant Colonel Cunningham. Said, you know, we never heard of this place, but a few hours before we took off, Chernobyl exploded. So they didn't know if we were going to go through any radioactive clouds. But the thing Mike and I, now we can laugh about, but when you think about it, they had Mike and I go fly without a second thought, but before anyone on the ground, any of this maintenance guys, and would get close to the plane, they checked it out. So that was one story. Another story, real quick, because Eddie and I, it's about us. Mike and I were TDY to Kadena, Okinawa, Japan. And this is, I think, 87, July 87. And a special mission came up, very special mission, directed from the president, for us to take some pictures of Iran. So the mission planners were really busy checking it out, and at first they were going to have the flight come from England, shorter flight and everything. But a couple days before the flight, France refused to let us overfly them. So they changed the mission to fly from Okinawa. Great for Mike and I. In the meantime, we are still a pretty new crew. They decide to send Ed and his backseater, Kurt Osterheld, over to fly the mission. Get a more experienced, instructed pilot and instructor RSO. It's that big a mission. So they flew over, getting ready to fly the mission. The deck commander, Colonel Allison, decided he doesn't care what Beale said. Doug and Mike were there. They've been flying Kadena missions. They're going to fly the mission. So these guys were not happy. Anyway, they send 25 tankers, KC-135s and KC-10s over, pre-deployed them to Kadena and to Diego Garcia. I mean, it was that important a mission. We had 25 tankers with spares. So Mike and I get the mission. We go out to our primary plane. There's 2 planes at Kadena. We get in. It's broken. I can't remember what was wrong. So instead of launching the air spare, who were pre-flighting the plane next door, Colonel Allison says for Mike and I, just move over to the spare. Again, they were annoyed. They lost it twice now. So we got into the spare, took off. They fixed the other plane. Eddie and Kurt took off behind us after about 20 minutes or whenever. It was, I checked out all the systems and I called them to say, you can go home. And you could tell in their voice they're very disappointed. So we then flew the longest flight in the last 15 years of the program. We flew 11 and a half hours. We flew from Japan over Thailand, under India. The funny part of the story is it's undercast the entire time during that part of the flight. And as important as this flight was, they decided to use an OBC, an optical bar camera, which cannot see through clouds instead of the radar. The resolution's better, so if you can use the OBC, that's what they wanted us to do. So we come in for our last refueling right outside the Straits of Hormuz, hooked up with the KC-10, and just as we went through the Straits of Hormuz, it was like someone just spread his arms. It was perfectly clear. And I remember mentioning Mike, some captain at Harvey Air Force Base is a very lucky man. Because if it was undercast, that was an expensive mission, an SR and 25 tankers. But we came back after 11 and a half hours. They had I'll tell you, that suit is comfortable for 4 to 6 hours. 12 hours in the suit, they had to pull us out. That's about it.
As they mentioned, my name is Mike Hall, and one of the maintenance guys, but avionics maintenance was my specialty. I like to tease these guys that I qualified to fly the aircraft, but my IQ was way too high. So they wanted to keep us on the ground to fix this airplane every time it came back. But on my intro here, the most important thing I want to say is I was very lucky. I married my high school sweetheart right out of high school and joined the Air Force immediately. I picked the electronic warfare career field because didn't know anything about it. It just sounded like a very interesting equipment you could work on. My first duty assignment was with the U-2s, the other aircraft that Kelly Johnson, high altitude reconnaissance. Worked on it for a few years, and then they decided to move the whole program from Tucson, Arizona up to Beale Air Force Base where the SR-71s were at. In June of 1976, I got to walk out to the flight line the first time and see my first SR-71 aircraft, which was very important. I was blown away, like a lot of people are the first time they see this aircraft. I had to go home that night and tell my wife that, I'm sorry, dear, but you're going to have to share me with another beautiful lady for as long as I can possibly work this aircraft. Pardon? The SR was the one I fell in love with when I went out after working the U-2. Saw the SR. Yeah. And so she realized that, and every time a TDY would come up, I would be the first one to have my hand up. Didn't matter where you were going, how long you were going to be gone. And a lot of times we didn't know. But I'd kiss her goodbye, kiss my daughter goodbye, and say, I'll see you when I see you. From that time on, I was able to work both the U-2 aircraft till 1979, where I accepted an assignment over to Okinawa, where our first operational detachment was at. And it was a great operation. It was a 3-year tour, but I stayed 8 years because of the mission itself. We flew operational missions every week, whereas at Beale, a lot of them were training missions. In 1987, I moved back to Beale. Worked the U-2 and the SR till 1990 when they shut the program down. U-2 for 4 more years. And then in 1994, Congress mandated the reactivation of 2 aircraft. And I was very fortunate at that time to be selected to help with the reactivation. And my best times with the aircraft, of course, the 8 years in Okinawa, and then the total of 6 years with the reactivation. Quick story I'd like to share with you is in the mid-'80s while I was in Okinawa, we had a defensive system that protected the aircraft from surface-to-air missile systems. It had gone through an upgrade, and it had a new receiver put on board with that system. We didn't have any of those systems there at Okinawa, so somebody had to volunteer to go back and get training. Of course, my hand went up. I'll go back to Beale and get training on this new system. So I went back for 3 weeks. Luckily, that was when they were doing the Grenada overflights. And I was out on the flight line every day learning how to pre-flight the system, what characteristics to look at, and make sure it was good to go. Got back to Kadena. The aircraft came over, flew its mission all the way from Beale, past Alaska, down to Vladivostok, and then we recovered it. Had to pull the system out, put it in another aircraft, pre-flight it, send it back. What was so, like Ed said, a lot of job satisfaction came from knowing what was happening on your job every day. We got information back that during those 2 passes of that system coming over and going back, that the intelligence community had acquired more information from this new surface-to-air missile site than they had ever recorded in the past missions of either Navy or other programs that had been trying to seek this information. So there was always a great sense of job accomplishment with this program.
Wow, this is the first time I've ever done something like this. I'm Harvey Smith. I worked Photoshop and worked on the tech camera and the OBC that he showed pictures of earlier. I graduated from tech school and I went to Shaw Air Force Base working on the RF-4C cameras for 16 months. And then I went to Okinawa and worked on the airplane, the RF-4C airplane, for 3.5 years, where I spent 2.5 of it in Korea, TDY. Then I came to Beale in '77, and they originally signed me to the OBC and Tech shop, which the OBC is the SR camera, and the Iris, sorry. And the Iris is a same basic camera, just packaged different, that goes into U2. So I was there for 4 years, and then I went to, I learned the tech just before I got stationed over at Det 1. And for 3 years, that tech camera is the only thing I ever worked on. If it flew up until about a year and a half, I did it. I installed the film, I did the pre-flights, BPOs, everything. Helped put it in the airplane until my daughter was born, and then I took vacation. But I stayed there for 3 years, went back to Beale, and finally retired in '92. Then I went to work for Hewlett-Packard doing regulatory tests. Like Mike says, if there was a TDY came up, my hand was up, then I would ask them, well, where are we going? And what are we going to take? Because I just love going TDY. Now, sometimes I regretted that when I got there. When you're living in a tent and it's like 30 below, I mean, not 30 below, but 30 degrees, and there's a ditch underneath your cot that goes through, and it's like a wind tunnel. You're thinking, well, I could have been home in bed if I hadn't have volunteered for this. Well, an interesting story. I had just got back from Det 1 to Beale, and I walked in to talk to the shop chief, and he told me, he says, well, I need you on swing shift. Can you start to work tomorrow? Well, I had just got back, so, I wanted to end process, but he says, well, I really need you. So the next day I showed up on swings. Well, the next day I come in, there's a higher headquarters mission schedule where we have a prime and a backup. And I asked them, well, what's been done? And they says, well, the cameras are all ready, but there was an airplane flying with a ballast and a nose, and the nose that we need for the prime airplane. So as soon as that comes down, they're going to pull it into the barn, and then they're going to just pull it straight in, which they don't usually do at Beale, and then download the ballast and then take the nose off and put it on the other airplane. Well, pull the nose off, you got to walk all the way around all the barns and all the way back with this thing on a spider dolly that's got 5 wheels on it, and they want to go everywhere. So it takes every one of them, the swing shifters, to make sure it doesn't fall off. So we get that done, we put the cameras in, but there was a chief master sergeant, or senior master sergeant, that was the branch chief at night. And he says, well, you guys are not going to get this done before today. Hurry up and get out on the flight line. Wait for that airplane. And I told him, I says, well, by 9 o'clock, we'll be back in the shop board. Well, at 9 o'clock, we also had an iris that we had to download. So at 9 o'clock, we was driving down the ramp back to the shop with the iris and the trailer, and we had everything done. And all we had to do was watch heat for the rest of the night for the OBC. And one thing they don't, in the slides, a little bit about the cameras, the OBC, it takes a 5-inch by 6 feet long picture. It's a 140-degree scan, and the head on it rotates one way, and the film goes the other direction. And they get 6 feet of film across the slit in 1.71 seconds. That's about it, so thanks.
My name is excuse me, Floyd Jones, and when I joined the Air Force, Beale was my first assignment, and it was new. They wouldn't let us see the airplane for the first 3 months. And then when we finally did get on the airplane, I was totally amazed what we were doing. I worked mainly on the flight line and the inspection branch most of my career. I spent 22 years on the SR. I retired in 1986 and went to work for Lockheed and spent another 20 years working for Lockheed on the SR and the U-2. And I totally enjoyed the airplane. And when they retired it, it kind of broke everybody's heart. Especially you have to go from a good airplane, the SR, go work on the U-2. Yeah. So, but it was fun to work on. And then when he brought the airplane back, I went back on the SR until they finally closed it for the last time. And I dearly miss working on the airplane, even though it was, you would cuss it out every time when you worked on it because it would hurt you. You would try and take care of it. It would still hurt you. It would cut you. Numerous cuts and grazes on. It was horrible to work on, but it was very enjoyable. When the airplane took off, you knew you accomplished something. And for my little funny story, it happened early in my career. We were installing forward bypass doors on the SR, and at that time it was still new. We didn't have all the tech data how to take them out and put them in. So the policy was 2 people would work on one inlet and 2 people would work on the other inlet, and you would stay on the job until it was completed. You'd take the bypass doors out, inspect them, and at that time they had rubber seals on them, a silicone rubber seal. The seal would get very brittle in flight, so we had to replace all the seals. And Lockheed made the seals fit the doors perfectly. They'd give us a 20-foot roll of seal with no holes in it. You had to cut the seals per door by each section, which took about 3 days to make the seals work. And then when you do all the seals together, then you'd put the doors back in the airplane. And once you started putting the doors in, you didn't stop until you completed the job. And Lockheed used a dry powder lubricant to put the seals in. And one night, the last time I put them in, I got home late from work. My wife was curious, why are you so late? I said, I was at work. And she kind of didn't believe me. Reason being, I smelled too good. The dry powder lubricant I used was apple blossom talcum powder. And young kids being young kids, we put a little bit on the door and quite a bit on us. So the next day when I came home from work, I brought her a box of apple blossom talcum powder, and she, to this day, still has it. That's mine.
Being an engineer, I didn't get to fly or work on the airplane, but got to hang around with a lot of the people that did design it. Being the historian, I got access to a lot of the documents written by Kelly Johnson and others on what it took to create the airplane. But this is in the context of the fact that I've loved airplanes since I was his age. My mom saved drawings from when I was 5 years old of pictures of airplanes that I had. In college, the first posters of the Blackbird showed up, and I had one hanging on my wall, and I said, I'm going to work there someday. And I got to do that for 33 of my 39 years in the industry. When I hired into the Skunk Works in 1984, the 117 was black. You didn't talk about it, but I was working on multiple programs. They were all stealth programs, and I had tons of questions about the U-2, tons of questions about the Blackbird, and I understood the stealth technology that we were putting on the aircraft. But then I got to understand what was on the Blackbird. And the radar, the Blackbird had radar-absorbing structure, radar-absorbing material, stealthy antennas, coatings. It was shaped for radar cross-section, and it blew my mind that in 1958, 1959, a couple of years after I was born, these engineers were making this kind of pioneering breakthrough. And as I would look at the signatures of the Blackbird, it was stunning to me. But I will tell you, as much as the design of it and what it took to create it was stunning, I want to share with you a set of experiences and put some things in context for you, okay? So I got to go up to Palmdale to watch a launch. First thing we did when we got up there, we toured the airplanes that are in depot, being maintained, got to stand on them, walk around them, see them torn apart, and that was interesting. But then we stepped out onto the flight line area, and there was a bird getting ready to do a run-up. We walk underneath the bird, fuel is dribbling out of it. It was like small, thin streams of the JP, the jet fuel, coming out of it. And you've all heard the story, that the fuel is not very flammable and stuff. A crew chief off to the side took a cup of the fuel, lit a match, tossed it in it to prove that it wouldn't go off. So I'm standing under this airplane, fuel's dribbling out of it from a few different points. We move to the side because they're going to do an engine run. I say, I want to stand outside and watch this, and most of the maintainers go, you're an idiot. But they gave me earplugs and what are called Mickey Mouse ears, the ear protection devices, and I stood by the left wingtip to watch an engine run, okay? One of the things I was cautioned about was to keep my jaw open slightly. Just do that. So I did that. I'm standing there. They start the engines up. They go into full burner. There's 20 to 30 feet of flame coming out. I could feel my ribs moving around inside of me. We're basically this giant bag of water. And so you felt everything jiggling. You felt the ground vibrating. And I thought, I was kind of holding my jaw open from awe, okay, just like. And I closed my jaw down, and my teeth started chattering from the vibration. So I tried clenching my jaw as tight as I could to see if I could stop that from happening, and I couldn't. So I want you to think about the amount of noise that it takes to create that kind of vibration, and it's pointed away from you, okay? It's not even that it's pointed at you when it's making this noise. That is how much power that airplane had. We went inside. The pilots were in pre-breathing the oxygen. They were laying in Barca loungers. They looked like kings sitting there. Had on the orange suits, the space suits. And one of the pilots, the PSD people, the Physiological Support Division people, were swarming all around them, checking the suits for leaks. And they were getting ready to pressurize them. And when the suits are pressurized, you move into kind of this sitting shape like this. All right, so one of the pilots, when it's pressurized up, goes, come here and feel the suit. And it felt like squeezing a basketball. The suit was so taut and hard from the pressurization. And I want you to think for a minute about what it must be like to move your arms down to the stick and throttle, to try to reach switches if something has gone wrong inside the airplane, it loses pressurization, and the suit pressurizes. It's a workout, believe me. So the pilots, again, like kings, get up out of their Barker loungers, get out to the airplane. We watch everybody strap in. This was another airplane sitting on the ramp there. It was going up for a test flight. And we watch the engines start up, and it's really exciting. They close the lids, taxi out, and we get to hop in the car to follow the airplane out to Last Chance. It's a little place at the end of the runway where they pull all the safety pins out and everything. And we're taxiing right underneath, or we're driving right underneath the wing of the airplane as it taxis out. Gets down to Last Chance, pull the pins out of it, and then we're going to do what's called a FOD sweep down the runway, a foreign object debris sweep. So looking for nuts and bolts and other things that may be on the runway. Except it was a little difficult for me to understand how we could see anything because we were doing 100 miles per hour down the runway. They just pull out in this car and nail it and go racing down the runway as fast as they can. We get about 2/3 of the way down the runway, pull off to the side of the runway, and we hop. They start getting out of the car. The Air Force guys start getting out of the car. And so we get out of the car, and it's like, dude, we're on the runway. And chill, okay, it's okay. So, all right, fine. This was in Palmdale. The sun was setting down at the end of the runway where the Blackbird was. It taxis out onto the runway, so now the sun is very low here. The sky behind me is dark. The Blackbird sits there for a few seconds and then goes into full afterburner. So the exhaust plume of all that jet fuel being burned billows out behind the aircraft. The light is shining through that billowing exhaust, and it looks like gold foil. You ever seen gold foil like around Christmas presents or something? But all crinkled up. And so you see that thin black silhouette coming towards you with this gold shimmering behind it. The pilot rotates the aircraft. You see the flames of the engines bouncing off the runway as it heads towards us. The pilot brings it up, levels off slightly, starts bringing the gear up, and comes over us so low that he could have flown through the hangar back there where the Blackbird is parked. And then pulls it up into the darkening sky, and you see those two giant plumes of flame coming out the backside. I could have died right then and been a very, very happy man. All right, so now the airplane's headed up to altitude, and so I didn't get to experience this, but I want to put into context what these guys created and flew. So every operational mission was for a reason. As you heard, they would launch 2 Blackbirds, 25 tankers. A president would ask for information, and you made sure that it happened. Sometimes they would fly so close to a border that one navigation mistake could be extremely dangerous and cause an international incident. And that's the last thing that you really want to do, is cause an international incident with somebody that does not like you. You saw that the Astro Tracker could track their position to within 300 feet, and that's great. How close would you fly to a border sometimes? A few miles? You'd head at a border and turn? How far? 1/2 mile from a border. The aircraft flew a mile every 1.5 seconds. Okay? So a tiny mistake in navigation could be a really bad thing. And this is what their missions were like. And I want you to think, okay, so now the navigation of the aircraft is that critical. The maintenance of the systems and keeping the engines running is so critical on the airplane because it's the equivalent of driving your car as fast as you can all the time. I want you to think about that, just at full speed all the time. Now, you got to operate the radio and all the controls on the inside while driving as fast as you possibly can. If something goes wrong, it is 16 miles down to the safety of the surface of the earth. Okay? You have to drive in your car about 14 or 15 minutes on the freeway to go that far. I want you to think about that the next time you're on the freeway. Okay? The temperature outside, turn your oven up to 550 degrees. That's as hot as it goes. That's as cool as it was for the Blackbird. Open your oven door up and feel what that's like. Okay? It is incomprehensible what these men did and what the airplane did. And personally, I am thankful that they did it because they provided multiple presidents with information to stop a lot of bad things from happening. So you guys always have my eternal gratitude.
Open for questions, and I don't have a good mic, but anyway, a mic will come over to you, okay? And by the way, please speak fairly close to the mic because some of us don't hear too well.
Okay. Whoa, wait a minute. First of all, I want to say something about his comments about seeing an SR take off. One was at Beale Air Force Base for their air show. And luckily enough, I got to stand out by the runway and take pictures of the SR taking off. Incredible. But what I want to know is all the cameras and stuff, you know, they had to have some sort of glass to look through. How did they keep the cameras cool? Because back in the days of film, everybody knows film is pretty sensitive to heat. So how did they keep this stuff cool?
Okay, the OBC ran at a constant temperature of 105 degrees. So once we installed it in the airplane, we would put a heater cart on the nose and through one of the windows, and we would heat it at 105 degrees, 18 hours prior to flight. It needed to be at 105 for 12 of those hours. Then once the canopies are closed and he puts it in the standby, then we take the heater cart off and we put the window in, and the internal heaters on the camera start working then. Well, once it starts flying, the windows heat up to 200 degrees, and you have two of them. You have two of them. They're shaped like this, and it's right in the nose. Well, as the head rotates around by the windows, it heats it up. And as it goes across the top, they have the canopy sealed dump, which is negative 30 degrees, that's coming down on top of it through a shroud, and it cools it down. Well, we have a temp sensor. The front of the lens is about this big, and there's a temp sensor that looks like, well, wow, how is that not going to show up in a picture? But, you know, it's probably about a ½ inch wide, and it's in the center of the first element of the lens. And that's where they monitor the temperature. During the flight, the temperature will only vary about plus or minus a ½ degree. And it needs to stay there because the metal and the glass contracts and expands at different rates. And if it gets further out than that, then it will be out of focus. Now on the tech camera, it only had internal heaters and required heat or power and air being put on the airplane 6 hours prior to takeoff. And we had thermal monitors, which was basically capacitors, that it took 6 hours for them to charge up. And once they charged up, we knew that we'd had 6 hours of heat. And it kept the heaters in the camera, kept the camera at the proper temperature.
Well, to answer your question also, is that all the sensors, because the airplane gets so hot flying, and the defensive systems are air conditioned along with the cockpits. So the skin of the airplane gets hundreds of degrees, in temperature, but the inside of the airplane is air conditioned. So those sensors don't get nearly as hot as the skin of the airplane does. Is that about right?
Yes.
Yes. Anything else? Any other questions? Stand by, Stormy.
I can speak loud enough.
Can you? Go ahead.
You know, you look at the airplane, and I realize it costs a lot of money. But, you know, as a taxpayer, I wouldn't want to waste the money. And I look at that airplane out there, and it's got white wall tires. Now, Buicks in 1958 had white wall tires. Why are you spending extra money to have white wall tires on my airplane that I'm paying for?
Stormy's asking a question. He flew the SR-71 as well. The main tires are pretty much white wall tires. Actually, they're white all around. It's for heat reflection. It's also air conditioned to a certain extent. The nose gear, you notice, is not aluminum coated, which is what the white comes from. That's because it's up in near the cockpit where air conditioning is available to the pilot and the RSO. So anyway, also the tires are pressurized with nitrogen, so they don't expand and contract nearly as well. So anything else?
Stormy, those tires are silver. And they're BF Goodrich Silver Towns. That's the reason they're silver.
Stand by one.
I have a question in regards to probably tails. Like I said, I saw the SR-71 take off from Mildenhall. The U-2 would land at Lake Heath, where I was stationed at, when the winds were too strong and have to go over to Mildenhall the next night. But coming in across the Pacific, the rumor was that after you took on fuel, you were down 25,000 feet, and some of the approach radars, just from a regular airport, wouldn't be able to tell how high you were off the ground, so you would start climbing back up, and so your forward speed would be very slow, because you're flying back up to 80,000, and then all of a sudden you would level off and kind of surprise some of the West Coast radars, because you would go from, I don't know what your forward speed would be, but then you would level out for flight, and would appear you'd go from several hundred knots forward to 600 knots going forward. Would you kind of freak out some radar guys?
I don't think we ever went that slow, but
Yeah, but your change would be where the radar guy seeing forward movement towards his radar.
the
Go 18 stories.
radar controllers typically knew when we were flying, and they knew our flight profiles and everything else. So they, we typically didn't talk to them too much. Although on a training sortie we did. So operational sorties didn't talk too much until we got down to a certain altitude. Then we started talking to RAPCON. So anyway, you had a question.
Did any of you have any big encounters?
Yeah, go ahead if you like. Quite often, quite often you see the enemy fighters far, far below with their contrails. You could see them in a holding pattern. One time, when I was flying in the Barents Sea area, just north of, along the northern border of Russia, we had a lot of missions along the northern border of Russia, keeping a close watch on the submarine ports there and the nuclear-tipped missiles being loaded on those submarines and keeping up with where those. That was the SR was one way to keep up with where the Soviet submarines were, but so we often flew up along the Barents area. we had one mission where we would fly along the border, and then we would fly north, and then turn around and fly directly toward the Russian border, and then just in the nick of time, we turned to the right to parallel their coastline again. And they were used to that mission. So one time I saw, as I was flying directly toward the Soviet border, I saw maybe 150 miles ahead of me, I saw a contrail coming straight toward me, far, far below. And so as I started my turn, I knew that he would know about where I was going to turn. So I turned, and I kept, as I turned, I kept a watch toward the back, and I saw him far below zoom his airplane up, but then he completely ran out of airspeed and then just dropped away. I was told later it was a MiG-31. Go ahead. You want to tell Tom's story?
Tom and Dwayne, a crew, they're not here, but probably the closest encounter to you, 1987, I think, June. They were flying a Baltic mission, which is around in the Sweden and then around the Eastern Soviet Union. I forget what the emergency was. Do you remember? Whatever the emergency they had to come down. So they came down to 15,000 feet, and the Swedish Air Force noticed that a plane had descended from altitude to 15,000. So they sent out two, is it Vegans, the jets that they flew? And they came on the wing, one on each side of the SR-71. So they were taking them back towards Germany. All of a sudden, two MiGs showed up. And people say they saw the Swedish guys and they left. But people think that if the Swedish jets were not there, they would have taken a shot at the SR-71. The rest of that story is, so that's 87. 30 some odd years later, Tom's a lobbyist up in Virginia and a big member of the Air Force Association, so he had a lot of good contacts. He started doing research. He never knew the names, never met the four pilots that came up. So he did a research, and they finally found them. So last November, Tom went over to Stockholm with Air Force, I think, one-star general, and presented the four pilots with the United States Air Force Air Medal, thanking them for what they did.
To add something to that, I remember one time I was flying a German mission. I was going north along on the FRG side, the Federal Republic of Germany side, and it was undercast. I look out, and I say, hey, there's a contrail coming up from the East German side. And it turned out to be, it rolled out at about a 2 o'clock position. We pushed it up a little bit. We had several hundred miles to go before we turned back toward Mildenhall to recover. And by the time we did the turn, that airplane went from 2 o'clock position to 4 o'clock position. It was probably at about 30 miles or so from us. So we found out from intelligence later that that was a MiG-25, and in the process of turning away after the drag race, if you will, it had lost an engine, and when it landed with one engine out, they had to change both engines. So the MiG-25, which was designed to counteract the SR-71, was good for Mach 3 one time. And the SR-71, the more times it flew at Mach 3 plus, the stronger it got. So that airplane that's sitting back there is stronger than when it was first built, because the titanium gets annealed every time it gets hot and then cools. So that's a stronger airplane now than when it was delivered to the Air Force. Anything else? Go ahead.
You guys are also cool about describing your experiences Do you ever get that little boy excitement about how you're flying the most powerful airplane ever built and the most wonderful machine ever made?
Answer your question, yes. Yeah, we're all little boys at heart. So I know when my daughter, my number 2 daughter, was in elementary school, she's like 43 now. Sorry about that. But she was amazed when she was talking to her class that she thought everybody flew SR-71s because her daddy did. But we were at the right place at the right time, and emphasize we were just the tip of the iceberg. There are thousands and thousands of people actively supporting us. There's no way the crew members could fly an airplane without hundreds, if not thousands, of people actively supporting the airplane.
Vibration and the power of it?
No. You're in a spacesuit, and you don't even hear well, I guess you do in a background. You hear the engines. But, you know, the only thing you feel on takeoff is an acceleration. You get pushed back in the seat a little bit. You hear a distant sound, but it's not nearly as loud as it is when you're outside.
On the first question about the excitement, I mean, we all probably were in our 30s. We were well-trained. We were prepared for any mission. So we didn't worry about it or didn't think about it. You know, we were excited to go and never thought of it. But now, when I look back when Mike and I were over Murmansk, you know, up there, if we had to eject over the Barents Sea up there, I think they told us the temperature was minus 24 degrees. No, we would survive for 24 seconds once we hit the water. So now, as an older man, I think, what the hell were we doing?
The thing is, when we were young, we were bulletproof. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you tell us about the source of the titanium?
Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, it is what you read. One of the great stories in the Skunk Works was, you know, they needed to build this thing out of titanium. That was the only metal that was strong enough, light enough, that could handle the temperatures, but make an airplane. The problem was, at that time, the bulk of the titanium that was available in the world came from the Soviet Union. So Lockheed and the CIA set up a series of front companies to go buy titanium. And so this very front company would buy it from the Soviet Union, then that company would sell it to another company, and then sell it to another company, and ultimately it would end up in Lockheed's shops to build the airplane. All the titanium suppliers were out there trying to figure out, you know, who's buying all the titanium and where's it going, but they never could trace it. And, you know, but it's not like we were stealing it or anything. We bought it and we were going to return it to them, you know, just in the form of an airplane that overflew them.
Yes, sir.
The story about the Baltic flight makes me wonder about when you had to refuel. Was that dangerous? Was there risk when you had to come down and refuel?
Well, every mission we air refueled, so it took a lot of practice to get good at it, and once we got very proficient at refueling, we took a lot of pride in being able to refuel without disconnecting from the tanker. We would pull up to the tanker. There were director lights underneath the tanker that said go forward or back or up or down, so we were flying formation on the tanker and using those lights as a guide. The boomer in the tanker would extend the probe and plug into the airplane, and so refueling was routine on every mission.
Wait a minute.
I'll take that. We took off out of Kadena, Japan, one day, and we went up North Pacific toward the Kamchatka Peninsula. We were on the boom refueling, and my backseater said, "Hey, what's that?" I said, "Where?" Of course, I'm concentrating on the tanker and refueling. He says, "Over there at the left." I glance over, and there's a couple of MiGs coming up there. And we are very vulnerable when we're that low and that slow behind the tanker. Fortunately, they just were looking. They didn't have any bad intent. I think they weren't willing to take the political heat for doing anything. And of course, once we got topped off with fuel, we did our acceleration, and they weren't going to touch us then. So, but to answer your question, on rare occasions.
All right, wait a minute. Before we go, I want to address this thing of tanking just being a routine everything day, like you go down to the 7-Eleven and buy a Coke, okay? So the made up is done for an operational mission in radio silence, okay? And so I want you to think about the navigation accuracy that it takes to wind up in the right spot behind a KC-135 that is going at its max speed, okay? The tanker is trying to get up right against its maximum Mach number because the Blackbird is slowing down to about as slow as it can go. Now, the Blackbird's coming in, it's fairly light, but its angle of attack, its nose-up attitude is pretty high, which is a good thing because when you're sitting in the cockpit, those two front windows look like little postcards that you're looking through. You have almost no peripheral vision through your helmet at all, so your visibility is incredibly constrained. You're looking through a soda straw to see outside. So you have these nav lights that come up, or these position lights that bring you up into position. The guy hooks into you, and then he starts pumping gas into you. And you're hanging on the boom for 15 or 20 minutes for a full load?
Yeah, about 20 minutes.
About 20 minutes for a full load. I want you to think about how long 20 minutes is, okay? So they're pumping gas into you. The airplane's getting heavier and heavier. You're near your min speed, and now you start to drag behind. The airplane is starting to move back a little bit. So now you're pretty much up at max power because the airplane's very draggy, nose up. Your throttles are very high because you're very draggy. You need to go into afterburner in order to stay on the boom. So you'll pop one of the engines into afterburner to make up for that thrust to move back up, except that's an afterburner on one side of the airplane, which means the airplane is trying to yaw on you, okay? And so you're sitting there, popping in and out of burner, working the rudders and the flight controls because this is not the easiest airplane in the world to fly, to stay on that boom in a relatively small envelope for 20 minutes while they put gas into you so you can continue your mission. That is what routine meant to them.
However, that being said, about every hour and 15 minutes, hour and 20 minutes, we had to refuel. It took about 30%, maybe 40% of our fuel just to accelerate and climb. The tankers were always there to refuel us. Now, granted, what Steve's talking about going in an afterburner, we typically, about 5,000 feet or 5,000 pounds to go, we'd say, hey, and we'd talk on the boom interphone, hey, boomer, left burner's coming. And it was you really had to do that, especially at night, but because it was very, very obvious. You go to minimum afterburner on the left engine, and you go 1,001, 1,002, 1,003. It takes about 3 seconds to light, and you want to pull the right throttle back because once the afterburner lights, and even in minimum burner, it's going to accelerate. So you have to modulate your power with the non-afterburning engine. And of course, you're flying kind of sideways, standing on the rudder to get your last. You do not want to drop off the boom, and have to get back on before you get to end air refueling. It was routine. We did it all the time. So we got, I think, pretty good at it. But the important thing is we were on the boom. The backseater was managing the number of pumps from the tanker because you could not put a huge volume in as the airplane got pretty close to full tanks. Otherwise, it'd blow you off, and you did not want that. So anyway, it became, I'll say, routine, even though nothing's routine. At night, in turbulence, nothing's routine. So, but you have to do it. Anything else? Yes, sir.
I have to ask, no accusation of cowboys, but has there ever been any history of high-speed, low-altitude passes?
High-speed, low-altitude passes?
As in buzzing the runway?
We would occasionally do something like that, either during an air show. You had to be real careful with the airplane. Ed did that on his record run back at Washington, Dulles.
Wait. Yeah, but there was one flyby for the Lockheed people where you need to tell that story because you got a little slow and a little low.
That was somebody else.
Oh.
I know nothing. The airplane, by the way, was extremely honest as long as you gave it the opportunity to be honest.
You might be, I don't know which story that you're thinking of. Did it happen over in England? Was that?
No. Weren't you the one that flew the flyby in Burbank for Kelly?
Oh, yeah, that was a...
yeah, you got a little slow there, right? Because, yeah.
No, we gave them 3 good flybys, exactly as planned. I might have been a little closer to them than they wanted me to be, but...
I wasn't there, but my buddies were, and it was overcast that day. The Blackbird came around for 3 passes, and on the last one, he was very low, almost over the crowd. A friend of mine named Vicky was digging her nails into a buddy of mine whose name was Chuck out of fear that the bird was going to come down on top of them. But Ed grabs burner as he came by, and I will tell you one of the stories that you don't hear very much about. Kelly Johnson was deep into Alzheimer's at the time and really didn't know too much of anything. And Ben Rich, his successor, who was running the Skunk Works, arranged to have Kelly driven out in a limousine for this celebration, which was the Blackbirds are going to be retired, and this was a thank you flyby for everybody down in Burbank at the Skunk Works. And so Kelly was in a limousine with blacked out windows and stuff, and Ben rolled the windows down a little bit, and he was hoping that the roar of the jet engines would spark a memory for Kelly. And as Ben tells the story, the airplane comes roaring by, and he looks over at Kelly, and he can see a tear come down Kelly's cheek. So,
yeah, that was really a huge honor to get to. They asked when the airplane was announced to be retired. Ben Rich got permission for us to make passes for the Lockheed employees down at Burbank. The airplane had never been seen in flight down at Burbank before. So we went down, flew down at the end of one of our training mission or test missions, flew 3 passes, and I looked. There were several thousand Lockheed employees all along that runway. It was just a huge honor to fly the airplane for those folks who had devoted so much of their lives to supporting the airplane.
When we're done here, one of the guys had printed out, I don't know why, hundreds of pictures of talking about air shows and passes. Mike and I were flying the 1986 Mildenhall F-8, and we had 13 fireballs come out. It's a long story what happened, but I have a whole bunch of pictures left. Anyone wants one, just come up and I'll give it to you at the end.
I think Mike has one more comment, right?
You know, this was an amazing aircraft. But of course, meat and potatoes was to gather information on the ground, what our enemies are doing, help our allies and our own government to make, hopefully, realistic decisions. I did some calculations to give you an idea of the capabilities of some of our systems that we had, the sensors on board. The technical camera that Harvey mentioned earlier, it was a very high-resolution camera, and it could reach out 23 miles from either side of the aircraft. So just think you got an aircraft flying 15-plus miles up. It could reach out 23 miles and take a very high-resolution picture. For your locals here, that would be just south of the Middletown. So if you take that distance from here to Middletown, that's how far we could reach and get a very high-resolution ground picture. The next ring from the aircraft would be the optical bar camera. It could reach out 41 miles from the aircraft and take a high-resolution picture. Well, that's about just south of the 275 bypass from here at the Dayton Museum. The next one is the ASARs, the radar system that could take a ground radar image of the ground. Well, it could go out 115 miles. Well, that's just north of Lexington, Kentucky, and get a high-resolution radar image of the ground. We also, my shop also took care of a signal intelligence system. So as they're shooting signals up to try to track the radar or try to launch a missile at the aircraft, we had a system on board that would record all those ground radars and their characteristics. It was recorded on 2 different recorders that we had. The EMR could go horizon to horizon, depending on the strength of the transmitting signal. And that would be 375 miles at 80,000 feet. So that takes you out to Washington, D.C. If you're talking on your cell phone, Washington, D.C., we could pick that up if our system went down that far in the RF range. We didn't scan the RF range that low because it's a very, you would want a long recording of an audio recording, but it was for the radar, surface-to-air missiles, long-range track radar, and other threats to the aircraft. So not only the aircraft was amazing, all the sensors that this aircraft would carry, the engineering to keep the pictures in focus, and the capability to scan a whole wide range of frequencies. It was just a pleasure to work on, and like I said before, a lot of job satisfaction.
And folks, I know this has taken quite a while. Thank you very much for being here. We'd be more than happy to answer any questions you might have one-on-one. We got a couple SR-71 guys in the audience. We know that. So anyway, thank you very much for showing up. We sincerely appreciate it. Thank you for loving this airplane, hopefully as much as we do. It means a lot to us, and that's why we come to something like this. Anyway, thanks very much.